Hi everyone, welcome back. So in my previous video, we have clearly understood the meaning and definition of promise, contract and agreement. So, contract is an agreement enforceable by law. An agreement is a promise or set of promises which are forming consideration for each other, and promise is an accepted offer. We understood the difference between these three terms using some real life situations. Now, before we move further, I want to make you understand a very important concept about domestic and social contracts. So to explain this, let me explain this concept through an example. So, let's say a father tells his son, if you behave well this month, I will give you ₹1,000 as pocket money. Now, the son behaves well, but the father does not pay the money. Can the son go to the court and file a case against his father? The answer is no. But why? You may ask me, there was an offer which was made by the father. There was an acceptance by his son which resulted in a promise. There was also consideration for each other resulting in an agreement. But the object was also lawful and both of them agreed at their will. Now, when all these conditions are satisfying the definitions that we learnt in the previous video, then how is the answer no to the question? Why can't the son go to the court of law is very simple. It is because this is a domestic agreement or a social agreement and not a commercial contract. The Indian Contract Act does not apply to domestic and social agreements. In such relationships, like between the father and the son or husband and the wife, the law presumes that there is no intention to create legal obligations between the parties and thus an agreement cannot become a contract. So, even though there is a promise and even though there may be an agreement, this is not enforceable by law simply because it is a social and domestic agreement. That's why this promise fails the test of enforceability and hence it is not a contract. So please remember, social and domestic agreements are not contracts because they lack the intention to create legal obligations amongst the parties. With this, I am sure all of you will be able to clearly distinguish between promise, agreement and contract. Let's now understand the difference between agreement and contract. So agreement is a promise or set of promises forming consideration for each other, whereas a contract is an agreement which is enforceable by law. Agreement is a wider term because it includes both legal as well as social agreements, whereas contract is generally a narrow term because it only includes legally enforceable agreements. Agreement may not create a legal obligation always, but contracts always creates a legal obligation between the parties. All agreements are not contracts, but all contracts are definitely agreements. So now let's understand when an agreement becomes legally enforceable. So, for an agreement to be legally enforceable, it must satisfy certain legal requirements which are stated in Section 10 of the Indian Contract Act 1872. And also, though some of the conditions are not stated in Section 10, it becomes very important for an agreement to fulfill all these legal requirements to become enforceable in the court of law and thus become a valid contract. Firstly, let's understand some of the legal requirements which are not stated in section 10 but still are considered very essential to form a valid contract. Have you ever seen an agreement which says, I promise to sell the car to myself at rupees 1000? No, right? It also sounds very illogical. Why? Because one cannot contract with himself. There has to be minimum two parties to the contract to make an offer and to accept the offer. The contract can be made between natural persons and also between artificial persons like companies, partnerships, etc., having a legal existence. What needs to be noted here is that the identity of the parties must be ascertainable. One of the important case laws that can be noted here is the state of Gujarat versus Ramanlal S. and Co. So what happened in this case? The partnership was undergoing dissolution and the assets of the firm were getting divided amongst the partners. Now the sales tax officer felt that this is a contract of sale and must pay tax. But the case was dismissed saying that this is not a contract because there were no two parties involved. The partners were the owners to the partnership firm and were joint owners of those assets, and this transaction cannot be considered as a contract of sale because this was mere distribution of assets. Hence, it becomes very clear that there must be two parties to form a valid contract, though it is not stated in section 10. The next important legal requirement, which is not stated in section 10 but still considered essential, is that the parties must intend to create legal obligations. Now, a very important case law that needs to be noted here is with regard to Mr. Balfour and Mrs. Balfour. So, Mr. Balfour would have agreed to pay his wife certain amount as maintenance every month while he was abroad. However, he failed to pay that promised amount and Mrs. Balfour sues him in the court of law for the recovery of this amount. But however, this case was dismissed saying the parties did not have an intention to create a legal relationship and therefore does not amount to a contract, and this becomes a social agreement or a domestic agreement where the Contract Act does not apply. Therefore, it is essential that the parties must have an intention to create a legal obligation for each other. Further, let's understand a few more legal requirements that are not stated in section 10 but still essential to form a valid contract. Firstly, I'm sure you all know that whenever you buy or sell an immovable property like building or land, a registration is must, which means a written document is a must where the parties have signed and all the terms and conditions to that particular transaction has been clearly stated, and this is given by its statute. And also with regard to insurance, it always has to be a written document. Therefore, it's clear that these statutes regarding insurance and property are clearly stating that for forming a valid insurance policy or to form a valid registration of properties, there must be a written contract. But however, Indian Contract Act does not say that the contract must always be written. It can also be verbal, that is oral, and the legal implications are the same. But however, the statutes which I mentioned earlier requires that the contract must be written. Now in such cases, the contract has to follow what is stated in the statutes and then only it can become a valid contract. Further, certainty of meaning becomes very important. Let's say a person agrees to sell 10 kgs of oil to Mr. B. Now, in this contract, what type of oil is not mentioned? Now, B can understand it as sunpure oil or sunflower oil. Again, it's not sure. Here, the meaning of the contract becomes very vague. It becomes indefinite. Hence, the certainty of meaning becomes very important and it has to be clearly stated. Next is with regard to possibility of performance. Now, whatever the terms are given in the agreement should also be capable of performance. For example, you cannot promise your friend or you cannot enter into a contract with your friend that you will do magic and bring down the moon for which she needs to pay 2 lakh of rupees. Is it possible for performance? No, right? And hence, it is not possible for performance and does not amount to a valid contract. So therefore, to form a valid contract, some of the legal requirements are that there has to be 2 parties involved. The parties must intend to create a legal obligation. Other formalities which are required by other statutes must be followed, and there has to be certainty of meaning, and also there should be possibility of performance of an agreement. So these essential elements are not stated in section 10 but still considered as essential. So in our next video, let's understand the essential elements or the essential legal requirements which are stated in section 10 in order to become a valid contract. Thank you.